I never thought that my own son's wedding would be the place where they'd finally show me just how disposable I'd become. The room was grand, echoing with laughter, glass clinks, the hum of violins, and I was being led through it like an unwanted guest in my own family's celebration. Clarissa, my daughter-in-law, barely turned her head as she muttered, "The help eats here," motioning toward the double doors swinging open into the kitchen. I followed. Not because I agreed, but because I knew this was the final performance. The mask had slipped. Clarissa's smile had always been thin, more muscle memory than warmth. Today, she didn't even bother with that. The kitchen was hot and crowded, waitstaff bustling around, too busy to notice me. Clarissa handed me off to a wide-eyed caterer and disappeared, her dress swishing like a curtain, closing on the last shred of civility. No seat number. No greeting. Not even a glance from Max, my son, when I walked in. I stood beside a stainless steel counter, trying to understand. I had paid for this. Every glimmering centerpiece, every gilded fork, every overpriced glass of champagne. Quietly, discreetly, as they requested. I hadn't needed recognition. But this was a declaration. A statement louder than any toast. I reached into my purse with a steady hand, pulled out my phone. I didn't tremble. I didn't cry. I just pressed the screen and held it to my ear. "Hello, Douglas. This is Evelyn Monroe. Cancel the $40 million transfer to Trent Holdings. Effective immediately." Silence for a beat. Then, "Are you sure, Mrs. Monroe?" I've never been more certain. The words sliced through the air like a clean blade. I could hear laughter dying out in the next room as a new song began to play. I didn't stay. I didn't need to. Clarissa wanted to sideline me, to erase me as anything more than a bank account with wrinkles. What she didn't realize was that I'd been silent all these years not because I was weak, but because I was watching. And I saw everything. I stepped back into the corridor just long enough to see Max taking the mic on stage, grinning like a child finally approved by his own wife's standards. My son, whose business I'd saved with quiet money and anonymous investments, whose life I had carved out from my own hands when his father died. And now, he couldn't even give me a seat. I turned away before the applause began. They could toast without me, eat without me, smile and pretend their empire was built on merit. But the scaffolding was gone, and soon, they'd feel the free fall. Weeks earlier, I had offered help like I always did, quietly, anonymously, with no expectation of thanks. Max's business had been faltering for months. He hadn't said it outright, of course, but I saw the signs. Late-night calls with banks, hushed arguments behind his office door, his accountant pacing in the hallway during family brunch. I didn't say anything. I just reached out to an old contact and set up a blind investment. A lump sum, channeled through a third party into Trent Holdings, Max's company. I told them to keep my name out of it. I wasn't trying to control him. I just wanted to give him a cushion, a little wind at his back. Because that's what mothers do, even when their children forget what it costs us. But soon after the money cleared, Clarissa began suggesting I rest more. At first, it came wrapped in concern. "You work so hard, Evelyn. Why don't you take a spa weekend? You shouldn't be dealing with all these documents yourself at your age." She said it with that voice she used when guests were around. Soft, sugary, just enough to sound sweet without being questioned. I pretended not to notice. I nodded, smiled, thanked her. Inside, I kept track. Max parroted her once during a dinner, over duck confit and overpriced wine. "Mom, Clarissa's right. You've earned the right to take a step back." He reached across the table for my hand like he was offering me peace. I let him take it. I even smiled. But the moment I got home, I opened my ledger. They thought they were moving me aside, for my own good. But their timing was too neat. The faux concern, the soft shaming. Right after the money hit, I saw through it. I just didn't say anything. Because I needed to see how far they'd go. One afternoon, I overheard Clarissa on the phone while I was making tea. She's sharp, yes, but tired. I think it's time we relieved her of some responsibilities. I mean, it's not safe for her to be dealing with those kinds of accounts at her age, right? I didn't confront her. I poured my tea, stirred in lemon, and left her to her whispers. That night, I pulled out the investment agreement. There was still time to revoke everything. But I waited. Not because I was scared. Because I wanted to be absolutely sure. Max had once told me I was the strongest woman he knew. I guess he forgot. The thing about growing older is people stop seeing you. They see your silver hair, your steady gait, the way your hands tremble slightly when you reach for the sugar spoon, and they decide you've faded. They forget that just because you've grown quiet doesn't mean you've grown weak. I still drive myself to the library every Wednesday to help with the children's reading hour. It's a small room, always too warm and slightly dusty, but I love it. The kids listen, they still believe in stories and the women who tell them. But at home, I started to notice things shifting. Clarissa's tone, when she visited, grew more clipped. She'd call out from the front hallway, "Do you need help organizing your meds again, Evelyn?" Even though I'd never once forgotten a dose. She brought up retirement accounts over tea like she was talking about a vacation. And one afternoon, when Max stopped by alone, something he rarely did anymore, he stood in my living room and said, "You know, Mom, if anything ever happened, we'd make sure you're taken care of." He meant it to sound comforting, but there was something in the way he said "we" that made the back of my neck prickle, as if I were no longer part of the equation. They'd started referring to my independence as eccentric and my solitude as concerning. Clarissa said it plainly one evening after dinner. She had a glass of wine in her hand, one heel kicked off under the table. "You know how old people cling to control?" she said with a little laugh, "just to feel important." She didn't look at me when she said it. Max did. Briefly. But he said nothing. It wasn't just the condescension that stung. It was how natural it came to them. How easily they'd reduced me to a fragile inconvenience. Like I hadn't spent 20 years running a business, making payroll, negotiating contracts with men who'd barely hide their smirks. It would have been easier if they had screamed, demanded, or accused me of something. But they didn't. They simply erased me, piece by piece, behind smiles and polite tones and soft suggestions that my best years were long behind me. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just poured another cup of tea and made a mental note of every word. Because I'd built everything in their lives, from their company to their comfort. And I knew then what I hadn't admitted before. They loved my money more than they loved me. It was raining that Tuesday. Not the dramatic kind, just a quiet drizzle that made everything seem heavier than it really was. I'd come over to watch the kids, something I used to enjoy. Clarissa was out at a luncheon, and Max was in meetings, which I knew was code for avoiding his own family until dinner. The boys were in the den watching cartoons, half asleep on beanbags. I was cleaning up the kitchen, moving with that quiet efficiency they'd long stopped noticing. Then I saw it. A manila folder on the edge of the counter, slightly damp at the corner, where someone must have set down a coffee mug. I wouldn't have looked twice until I saw my name through the thin paper. I froze. There it was in neat print across the top, durable power of attorney, Evelyn Shaw. At first I thought it was old, something I'd signed back when I had surgery years ago. But no. This was dated 3 weeks ago. I picked it up, heart pounding, and opened it slowly, the way you lift a bandage you know is going to sting. There were several pages, each more surreal than the last. Legal phrases jumped off the paper. Transfer of authority, financial discretion, convenience and welfare of the principal. Max and Clarissa's names appeared again and again. Clarissa's handwriting was scrawled in the margins with notes. Ask Evelyn after wedding. Attorney already reviewed. Backdate if needed. Backdate. I put the folder down and stepped back like it had burned me. My fingers were trembling now. This wasn't about helping. This wasn't about safety. They were planning to take everything. Without telling me. Without asking. Using concern like a scalpel to carve me out of my own life. The worst part? They hadn't even bothered to hide it. Just left it there on the counter like grocery coupons. Like they were so sure I wouldn't see, or if I did, I wouldn't understand. I remembered Clarissa's little laugh. Old people cling to control just to feel important. Maybe I did. But at that moment, I didn't feel old. I felt awake. I tucked the folder back exactly where it was, wiped my fingerprints off the cover like I was erasing a crime scene, and returned to the den. The kids were still giggling at some cartoon, oblivious to the storm that had just cracked open inside their grandmother. Later, when Clarissa returned, she kissed me on the cheek and asked if the boys had been any trouble. I smiled. "Not at all," I said. "It was enlightening." The next morning, I didn't rage. I didn't scream or call anyone to accuse them. I just got dressed and drove to Harriet's house. Harriet LeClaire had been my friend for over 40 years. We met at a PTA bake sale back when our boys were still in braces and spilled juice boxes. But unlike me, Harriet kept her law license active long after retirement. People still sought her out when they needed the truth, wrapped in calm. She answered her door in a lavender robe, with tea already steeping in 2 cups. "You've got that face," she said, before I even stepped in. "The one you used to wear when your ex-landlord tried to double your rent." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She just led me to the back porch, where the breeze smelled like roses and fresh grass. I told her everything. Every word Clarissa had muttered. Every signature I hadn't given. The folder I found. The backdating. Even how Max looked away when I needed him to look at me. Harriet didn't react the way I expected. She didn't gasp or curse them out. She just sat forward, one hand resting on my knee like an anchor. "So what's the next move?" she asked, steady as stone. "I don't know," I whispered. "I feel like if I confront them now, they'll just twist it. Say I'm paranoid or confused." "You're not confused," Harriet said. "You're outnumbered." That's when it clicked. They weren't waiting for me to get weaker. They were manufacturing the illusion that I already was. We spent the next hour talking. Not about revenge. Not yet, but about protection. Harriet explained how asset control could be quietly restructured, how trusts worked, how signatures needed witnesses, and how even attempted fraud had its tells. She didn't tell me to act fast. She told me to act smart. As I left, she handed me a slim envelope. "Names of 3 attorneys who owe me favors. Use them if you need backup." "Harriet," I said as I hugged her goodbye, "what if I'm wrong? What if they're just clumsy?" She pulled back, met my eyes, and said, "Then you'll still be a woman who protected herself before she had to." That night, we all sat around the family table again. Clarissa, Max, the kids. Clarissa poured wine like nothing had changed. Max laughed too loud. No one suspected a thing. And I played my part, smiled, nodded, complimented the roast. But inside, I had begun. I wasn't planning a fight. I was preparing a defense, because no one was going to quietly write me out of my own life. Not while I still remembered how to hold a pen. That night, after the house grew quiet and the wine glasses were rinsed and shelved, I went into my study and pulled out an old box from under the desk. It was dusty, hadn't been opened in years. Inside were my journals, ledgers, scraps of paper with scribbled ideas, receipts faded from time, napkins with calculations, a list titled "First Month Expenses," written in my late husband's careful print. It all smelled like ink and effort. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one Max once used to do homework, and read until midnight. The earliest pages were shaky, full of doubt. I could see it in the margins. Questions about licensing, a note about what soap supplier to use, cost breakdowns that didn't quite add up. But month by month, the handwriting grew more confident. The numbers tightened. The margins got neater. I saw every sacrifice I made, every decision I owned. There was an entry about the day I fired our first delivery driver. He was late 3 times, and I had cried in the break room afterward. Not because I felt guilty, but because I realized I had it in me to run things without asking for permission. And then there were the notes about Max, what he liked for lunch at age 10, how I saved up to buy him his first computer. A scribbled sentence, "Don't forget his science fair on the 14th. I paused there for a long time. That version of me, the one who was learning business and motherhood in the same breath, she had built the company they now called his, and they were so eager to erase her. I stared at one journal entry dated the year after my husband died. I don't know how to do this alone, it read. But I don't have a choice. Max still needs me. The business still needs me. I'll fake it until I don't have to. I ran my fingers along the edge of the page, the paper soft from age and touch. Maybe that was my mistake. I didn't stop faking it. I didn't let them see how much it still hurt to be dismissed. I smiled through their condescension. I laughed politely at Clarissa's barbed compliments. I pretended that being sidelined was somehow a kindness. But now I knew. I hadn't become invisible. I had been deliberately blurred. So I made a decision that night. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a quiet, deliberate promise to myself. I would protect what I had built. Not because I needed the money, but because they needed to remember who I was before they decided who I should be. It started with a voicemail to my financial advisor, Thomas. Just one line. We need to review my estate structure. Discreetly. He called me back within the hour, his voice respectful, curious. I'd known Thomas for years. He handled my portfolio ever since I sold the company. He always spoke to me like someone whose mind still mattered. That alone made him rare. We met at his office on a gray Thursday morning. I wore beige slacks and brought store-bought muffins. I smiled like any grandmother might. He greeted me with coffee. Everything all right, Evelyn? Not yet, I said. But it will be. I told him, without naming names, that I suspected certain family members were preparing to shift financial authority away from me. I wanted safeguards in place immediately. I moved every liquid asset into a newly established trust under an alias I'd created in my 20s, M. Thorne, from my maiden name and my middle initial. I requested quarterly distributions routed to a separate account no one knew about, linked only to a private mail drop. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You planning to disappear? No, I said. I'm planning to be underestimated. We restructured everything. The trust, the titles, the controlling shares in Max's company, which, yes, I still held a majority stake in, though I'd kept it quiet. It had been gifted to him in public, but never fully transferred on paper. Clarissa always assumed that if I wasn't involved, I'd already let go. She forgot how many things I built quietly. The next week, I noticed the shift in her tone. She dropped a new phrase in conversation over dinner. You're being so peaceful lately, Evelyn. It's good to see you accept things. Accept? She thought my silence meant surrender. She mistook restraint for retreat. That night, I smiled across the table, her words ringing like a bell I'd heard too many times. I'm just grateful, I replied softly. Sometimes it's nice to let go and watch others handle things. Max smiled too, relieved. See? I told you she's easing into this. And Clarissa actually nodded, smug. That night, I lit a candle in the living room, not for prayer, but for punctuation. They were so sure they had finally subdued me. They saw the quiet and mistook it for submission. But I wasn't done. I was just beginning. The wedding was a week away. The house was a flurry of white garment bags, guest lists, and overpriced calligraphy samples. Clarissa had commandeered the dining room for her final fittings, and I'd been asked to keep the boys upstairs more times than I could count. I played along. I folded napkins. I offered tea. I watched. That Thursday afternoon, I was gathering laundry from the upstairs hallway when I heard voices through the cracked guest room door. Clarissa was in there with her bridesmaids, two women I barely knew and never cared to. She's so easy to sideline now, Clarissa said with a soft laugh. I swear, at first I thought she'd put up a fight. But Max was right. All you have to do is give her a cup of tea and talk slowly. The other women giggled. One asked something I couldn't catch, and Clarissa replied, No, she hasn't signed yet, but we'll get her to. After the wedding, when she's all emotional and surrounded by family. Honestly, it's kind of sad how easy it is. I didn't move, didn't breathe. She kept talking. Max thinks we're being patient, but honestly, I just want to get the paperwork done and be done with pretending. I mean, she still volunteers at a library like it's 1990. She thinks books make her sharp. More laughter. Then the final jab. It's like dealing with a child who thinks they're helping. We just smile and wait for her to sit back down. I stood there, my hands full of a towel I suddenly didn't need. My heart didn't race. My eyes didn't sting. I just listened. And when it was over, when the zippers zipped and the heels clicked across the floor and the front door slammed behind them, I walked downstairs, past the dining room, past the bouquet samples, past the wine list they asked me not to overthink. I stopped at the hallway table. There, framed in brass, was the photo of my late husband, me, him, and Max, taken at Myrtle Beach the summer Max turned 6. My husband's arm was around me. His smile was crooked but warm. The sun made the top of Max's hair glow like copper. I stared at that photo for a long time. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt confirmation. Everything I'd suspected, every instinct I'd doubted. It was all right there, gift wrapped in Clarissa's smug little voice. And still, I said nothing. I folded the towel neatly and put it on the laundry basket. Then I went upstairs, turned on the kettle, and took out my old notebook. I wasn't going to stop the wedding. I was going to end the performance. I waited 2 days, just long enough to let them think they'd won. Then I called Thomas. We met again on a Saturday. His office closed to the public. He'd left the side door unlocked for me. Harriet came too this time, not for legal necessity, but because I wanted someone I trusted watching me reclaim what was mine. The air smelled like paper and new leather. Thomas pulled out the documents, the transfer of controlling shares, the trust finalization, the power of attorney nullification clause. Everything was in order. He slid them toward me, one by one. Once you sign, Evelyn, the family company becomes inaccessible without your consent, legally and irrevocably. The trust can only be unlocked by you or your designated successor. He didn't ask who that successor was, but Harriet already knew. Eloise, I said softly. She'll be the one. Thomas nodded, jotting down the details. As I took the pen in my hand, it trembled, but not from fear. The weight of years sat in my chest, not just the business years, but the silent ones. The ones I spent shrinking myself so they wouldn't feel threatened. The years I spent excusing rudeness as stress, manipulation as ambition. Harriet leaned closer, placed her hand gently over mine. This isn't revenge, she whispered. It's restoration. And it was. I signed. Page after page, stroke after stroke, I reclaimed what they thought they'd quietly taken from me. At the end, Thomas placed the last sheet into a folder. It's done. If they try anything, move funds, request authorizations, they'll hit a wall. He paused. Are you sure you want to keep this quiet until after the wedding? I nodded. Let them toast to family unity with champagne I didn't pay for. Let them feel safe. Harriet smiled. A storm never warns before it breaks. I walked out of that office lighter than I'd felt in years. My hands still shook, yes. But my voice? My voice was iron. When I got home, Max was waiting on the porch with a bottle of wine, probably sent by Clarissa as a peace offering for my cooperation. He smiled. We really appreciate you being so relaxed about everything lately. Clarissa's been saying how proud she is of you. I stared at him. My son. The boy I once carried through fevers, cheered for at science fairs, comforted through his father's funeral. He no longer saw me. But soon, he would. I took the bottle with a smile and said, "Tell her I said thank you." And then I went inside, locked the front door behind me, and poured the wine straight down the sink. 2 nights before the wedding, I opened my closet and stared at the rows of dresses, most of them older than Clarissa's career. I pulled out a soft gray suit. No shimmer, no silk. Just quiet structure, dignity stitched into every seam. The kind of outfit that didn't ask for attention, but demanded respect if someone knew where to look. I laid it gently on the bed, along with a small pair of flats. No heels. I wasn't dressing to impress. I was dressing to stand my ground, even if no one else realized that's what I'd be doing. No jewelry. Not the pearl earrings Max gave me for my 60th. Not the sapphire pendant Clarissa had once called charming in a retro way. I didn't need reminders of anything borrowed, gifted, or expected. I needed to arrive as myself. I packed a small clutch. Inside, my ID, a tissue, a copy of the signed trust document, just in case. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window, watching the late June breeze rustle the hydrangeas. Somewhere in the house, the water heater clicked, old pipes groaning with memory. I thought about the speech Clarissa would probably give, the toast Max might raise. I imagined him thanking the people who made this possible, probably referring to Clarissa's parents, people who dropped in with money and credit but not legacy. Would I speak? No, I would sit quietly. I'd smile when spoken to. And when Clarissa paraded her triumph around the room in sequins and champagne, when she assumed the crown of control had been passed to her, I would remain still. Because the thing about power is, it doesn't have to shout, it just has to endure. I rehearsed scenarios in my head. What if Max confronted me later? What if Clarissa tried to push the documents again, assuming I'd softened? What if, after all this, my son still chose her version of loyalty over mine? That last question stayed with me. I had to accept it. This might end with more than financial distance. It might mean walking away for good from both of them. And I was ready for that. Because being alone is better than being used. I placed the outfit carefully in a garment bag and zipped it shut. Then I tucked the trust documents back into my safe and poured myself a cup of tea. As I sat down, I whispered aloud, not to anyone present, but maybe to the woman I had once been. "You're not preparing for a party," I said softly. "You're preparing for a reckoning." The morning of the wedding came with sunlight so bright it felt almost cruel. I stood in the bathroom, staring at my reflection, toothbrush dangling uselessly in my hand. For a few seconds, I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. She looked composed, stoic, but her eyes, my eyes, held something different, something final. I finished brushing my teeth and pressed my palm against the cool glass. "You gave them everything," I whispered. "Now give yourself peace." My gray hair was freshly brushed, pulled into a low twist at the nape. No earrings, no perfume. I didn't want anything false clinging to me today. I slipped into the gray suit. The fabric fit just right. Not tight, not loose. It was the kind of suit you could vanish into, or stand tall in. I'd worn it once, years ago, to a mediation with a contractor who tried to double our fees. That day, I'd walked out with his signature on my terms. This suit held history. I sipped a small cup of coffee, watching the clock tick closer to noon. The ceremony was set for 3, with the reception to follow. I wouldn't be there long. I didn't need to be. Everything was already in motion. The documents were filed. The trust was active. My lawyer was briefed. Thomas was standing by. Harriet would check in with a single text. Green or red? If I sent back green, he'd proceed with delivery of the formal revocation to Max. If I sent red, we'd wait. I had one last choice to make, and I would make it only once I saw them. One last read of the room, of their hearts. And if they failed that final test, I would vanish from their lives as quietly as they'd tried to erase me. I walked through the house one last time before leaving. Touched the edge of the mantel where Max's baby photo still sat, face smudged from years of cleaning. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but all the tears had dried in the folds of old journals and sleepless nights. By 1 o'clock, I was in the car. Alone. No escort. No entourage. No illusion. As I drove toward the venue, I felt it. Something lifting. The weight of proving myself. Of waiting to be chosen. It wasn't mine anymore. The wedding might have been their stage, but I wasn't the audience. I was the turning point. And whether they saw it or not, today wouldn't belong to them. It would belong to the woman they'd underestimated, one time too many. He waited for me in a quiet cafe 3 blocks from the venue. Not at some towering law office. Not behind glass and marble. Just a corner table in a place that smelled like cinnamon and ground beans. That was my one request. Keep it simple. Keep it human. My lawyer, Simon, wore his usual navy blazer and wire-rimmed glasses. He stood when he saw me, not out of formality, but respect. "Everything's ready," he said, sliding a sleek black folder toward me. All we need is your signal. I nodded, my eyes scanning the documents one last time. A letter to Max, officially revoking any previously discussed estate allocations, clarifying in legal terms that no authority was or would be granted to him or Clarissa. A second envelope, sealed for the Trent Holdings Board. Notification of share restructuring and Evelyn Shaw's irrevocable consolidation of voting control. And finally, the third. A legal memorandum detailing every protective clause in the trust, copied to the family company's accountant, legal counsel, and board advisor. It wasn't revenge. It was closure. With paperwork. Simon sipped his coffee. Are you sure you want to go through with this today? I'm not sure of anything, I said honestly. That's the point. Because there was still that tiny thread inside me, frayed but not cut. The part of me that remembered Max's little hand holding mine after his father's funeral. The part that wanted to believe some small piece of him still remembered who taught him to be brave. But that thread wasn't holding up the structure anymore. It was just there. Green or red, Simon said softly. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The text to Harriet was already typed, cursor blinking. Green if I saw that last shred of respect in my son's eyes. Red if I didn't. That would be the difference between pause and strike. I looked out the window. People bustled past, dressed in suits, heels, flowered dresses, heading toward laughter and champagne, unaware that 3 blocks away, the woman who paid for their stage was deciding whether to burn it down. Simon didn't rush me. You're not doing this alone, he said. Not anymore. I looked back at him. That's the strangest part. I've never felt more alone, or more clear. At 2:45, I stood. The time had come. I zipped the folder shut, left it with Simon, and walked out of the cafe into the warm summer air. 3 blocks away, the ceremony music was already drifting into the sky. My heels clicked softly on the sidewalk as I walked toward it. I wasn't just showing up to a wedding. I was showing up to my own final decision. The venue was stunning, I'll give them that. White linen draped every surface. Peonies bloomed in glass vases, and crystal chandeliers glittered like falling stars. A quartet played near the archway, where Max and Clarissa would soon say vows surrounded by polished people who'd never worked a single shift in their lives. No one greeted me. No one offered a seat. A woman in black, one of Clarissa's wedding planners I assumed, whispered to another, then turned to me and said, I believe you're assisting in the back? I didn't correct her. I nodded once and followed her down the hallway, past the guest tables, through the swinging kitchen doors that separated the glimmering show from the ones who made it happen. There, among trays of champagne flutes and the hum of heat lamps, I found an empty metal chair against the wall. I sat down slowly. Nobody noticed. Nobody questioned. And I didn't mind. Because this was the moment. I pulled out my phone, no shaking hands, no emotion, just one action. I opened the draft to Harriet, and I typed one word, green. Then, without hesitation, I tapped send. Somewhere, 3 blocks away, Simon would open that folder. He'd deliver the documents to the Trent Holdings boardroom. A messenger would hand Max an envelope after the speeches. The trust, the shares, the revocation, every piece would drop into place, like dominoes quietly clicking toward collapse. I slipped the phone back into my clutch and looked down at the plated hors d'oeuvre. Clarissa's voice floated in from the ballroom. She was laughing, probably with a guest from one of the investor families. I heard my name, mocked lightly for still insisting on dressing herself. Then applause. The toasts had started. My eyes wandered to a tray of perfectly folded napkins, stacked like little declarations of order. One of the kitchen staff offered me water, probably assuming I was another vendor. I thanked him. There was something poetic about it, really. While they toasted family unity, the woman they tried to erase was undoing their illusion piece by piece, from the very room they thought she belonged in. The help eats here. They'd given me a seat in the kitchen, and I had turned it into a war table. I watched the flicker of the flames under the warming trays. Controlled. Contained. just like me. I heard the clinking of glass before I saw them. Clarissa's voice lifted, bright and theatrical, as she raised her champagne flute. To family, she declared, and to knowing when to pass the torch with grace. Laughter followed, tight, uncomfortable. A few guests looked toward the door, maybe wondering where I was. Most didn't. I slipped out of the kitchen without fanfare, walking slowly through the corridor where my pictures still hung, me and Max in the early days of the company, back when he still called me Mama and asked for my help instead of pretending he never needed it. I didn't go into the ballroom. I didn't need to. I crossed the marble floor toward the garden exit, heels echoing against the stone. I could feel the air shift behind me. Clarissa's voice hit its final crescendo, and to the woman who showed us what it means to trust the next generation. Applause. That's when it happened. A server brushed past me, gripping an envelope addressed to Mr. Maxwell Shaw, urgent, by hand only. I watched it move across the room like a blade hidden in lace. I kept walking. But in my mind, I could see it. Max taking the envelope, expecting a letter from an investor or a congratulatory card. His fingers pulling it open mid-smile, his lips parting, then freezing as he read the header, revocation of financial rights, immediate execution, the champagne still bubbling in his glass. The silence crawling into his throat before he even reached the second paragraph. And Clarissa, probably still smiling, oblivious for a few seconds more, until his expression changed, and the guests started to notice. I was already at the side gate when the whispers began. I didn't stop, didn't flinch. I heard someone calling my name faintly behind me. Maybe Max, maybe not. But I didn't turn, because there was nothing left to say. They'd toasted to family unity. And I had handed them a mirror. Let them drink to their own reflection now. The air outside was warm, but quiet. Just the sound of gravel beneath my steps, and the soft creak of the garden gate closing behind me. Behind those doors, the illusion was collapsing, and I was finally free of it. The sun was dipping low when I heard footsteps behind me. Fast, uneven, urgent. "Mom, wait." Max's voice. I didn't turn around. Not yet. He caught up to me by the side gate, out of breath, tie slightly crooked. The envelope still in his hand, crushed at the edges. "What is this?" he asked, holding it up like it was evidence in a trial he never imagined losing. "Why would you do this today?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. His face still held pieces of the boy I once held in my arms. The boy who used to wake me up with drawings and call me his hero. But they were buried, smothered beneath arrogance, fear, and the weight of a woman who had convinced him I was just a stepping stone. I didn't speak. I just reached into my clutch and pulled out the photo. The one from Myrtle Beach. The three of us, me, Max, and his father, grinning into the wind, sand on our clothes, sun in our eyes. I held it out to him. He took it slowly, confused at first. Then I leaned in and whispered, just loud enough for the wind to carry it where it needed to land. He'd be disappointed. Max flinched like I'd slapped him. "Mom, it's not what you think. Clarissa and I were just—" "You chose her," I said quietly. "Not bitter, not angry, just tired. Every time you stayed silent. Every time you smiled while she pushed me into corners." He shook his head, mouth moving but no words coming out. I stepped back. "I didn't take anything from you, Max. I just took back what was always mine." He blinked hard, as if trying to wake from a dream that had turned on him. "You're my mother." I nodded. "Yes. And that used to mean something." I turned then, finally, and began walking again. Down the quiet road, away from the venue, the guests, the noise, and the glass castles they'd tried to build on the foundation of my silence. He didn't follow. He just stood there, photo in one hand, shredded control in the other, watching as the woman he thought he'd sidelined took the only path she'd ever truly owned, forward.